that feeling in my throat. Am I scared to be alone? You can see the sad in my eyes as I hide behind my fake smile. Yeah, you used to call me, we would stay up hours talking about nothing. At least we had something. At least we had something. There's all that other love, but for me there's not enough. I feel so out of touch with reality. There's all that other love, why's it gotta be so tough? I ain't asking for too much, just something to feel. Happy people, touch me deep, yeah, lethal. Got me caught up feeling hopeless. How did I get so out of focus? Yeah, you used to call me, we would stay up hours talking about nothing. At least we had something. At least we had something. There's all that other love, but for me there's not enough. I feel so out of touch with reality. There's all that other love, why's it gotta be so tough? I ain't asking for too much, just something to feel. But for me there's not enough. I feel so out of touch with reality. There's all that other love, why's it gotta be so tough? I ain't asking for too much, just something to feel.
Hello and welcome to the last of our live Move Food TV 2021 sessions. We're delighted to have with us Professor Lucy Green with us. And for those of you who may need reminding, Lucy is Emerita Professor of Music Education at the UCL Institute of Education, London, UK. She is internationally known for her work in music education, particularly in relation to new pedagogies, popular music, gender, ideology, and the sociology of music education. Currently, she's beginning a new project concerning self-accompanied classical singing. The research is in its very early stages, but as part of the process, Lucy's made 2 self-accompanied CDs, Dowland songs from the Jacobean Parlour and Italian arias of the 17th and 18th centuries reimagined. Lucy's study of how popular musicians learn and her initial ideas for how their practices can be translated into formal music education has been described as a watershed moment in music education. Building on this work, Lucy led the informal learning pathfinder strand of the UK project Musical Futures, which took central characteristics of informal music learning methods and adapted them to classroom environments. This changing teaching approaches has resulted in a rise in student motivation. Lucy's work is used in schools and teacher training programmes in the UK, USA, Canada, Australia, Singapore, Brazil, Cyprus, and very many other places. Her teacher's handbook, Hear, Listen, Play, How to Free Your Students' Oral Improvisation and Performance Skills 2014, is a practical guide for teachers bringing together working classrooms, extracurricular groups and instrumental tuition. Her last book was co-authored with Dr. David Baker and is called Insights in Sound, Visually Impaired Musicians' Lives and Learning, and outlines the results of research into the lives and learning of blind and partially sighted musicians. Her publications have been translated into Spanish, Portuguese, German, Italian, Greek, Swedish, Dutch and Chinese. Good afternoon, Lucy, and welcome to Move Through TV 2021 Live.
Am I unmuted? Yes,
you are. No, you're absolutely fine. So we've got a number of questions for you this afternoon, Lucy. I do hope that we've got time for all of them. So I'm just going to dive straight in. It's really wonderful to have you with us. And I know that there are very many people who have used Musical Futures over the years. It's a long time now that Musical Futures has been sort of well sort of embedded within the sort of like certainly the UK educational system. But anyway, here we go. Let's just crack straight on, shall we? So, first of all, I'd like to ask you, the system in which teachers work has become increasingly formal, measured and judged over recent years, not least through the increasing importance placed on Ofsted judgments. How can we continue to encourage teachers to take that leap of faith into informal learning practices when they are working in such a formal system?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, isn't it? And I'm always cautious of trying to sound persuasive or evangelical about the approach, because I just don't think that's appropriate. No. If a teacher doesn't feel ready to do it, then don't do it. By all means, please don't feel that you're kind of being cowardly or something like that. And of course, you might not feel that. You might just be totally skeptical of the approach and think it's a load of rubbish and it won't work. But if somebody is even a little tiny bit willing to try it, then ways we can encourage them to do so are, one, that it is a tried and tested method. It's been tried and tested by teachers in countries, as you just said, and thank you for that lovely thing. You didn't even give me a chance to say thank you. As you just said, it's been tried in many countries with very different musical cultures and very different education systems. And it's been, the results from it have been very much the same right across all those nations. So it's a tried and tested model. The other thing to say is that a person doesn't have to try it for very long before they can see it. And I mean, we found in the early pilot stages of doing this that even the most cynical teacher, and we did have some,
I remember.
I mean, one man who, if he ever were to watch this, he'd probably know I was talking about him, but he came to the training and he sat, you can't see my arms, but he sat with his arms folded and his legs sticking straight out in front of him. And he had the sort of attitude of, you know, what do you think you're going to tell me? You know, I've been teaching for 20 years. And he was one of the most cynical. And another one who described herself as a control freak was very anxious about it. But by the end of the first lesson, that man was converted. And the other teacher was converted by about lesson 4 or 5. So you can try the approach for even one lesson and then pull the plug on it. You haven't harmed your children or risked Ofsted giving you a bad report by just doing that. So I would say to dip your toe into the water of any new thing is a really good way to approach it. The risk, having said all that, is that people sometimes think they're doing it, but they're not, and then they say it's rubbish, it doesn't work. I mean, there's not many examples, but one of the most difficult things, obviously, that teachers find is the business of standing back. And, you know, when I tried to explain what I meant by standing back, it took me a very long time. And the first kind of 6 teachers I worked with, I could see that they weren't getting it. I came up with this expression that teachers are asked to stand back and observe what the children are doing, empathize with the goals that the children seem to be setting for themselves, and attempt to help the children to achieve the goals that they're setting for themselves. And of course, it's not about standing back and going and having a cup of tea in the staff room. It's, as anybody who's done it will know, it is really full on hard work. It takes all your experience as a teacher and as a musician as well. But some people, I think, who have tried it, not many people have told me that. They probably just don't speak to me at all. I don't know. I've been criticised in writing by somebody who's never tried it and actually regretted saying it afterwards, but heavily criticised for de-skilling the teacher, allowing music education to fall into the hands of right-wing people who will say these teachers in Green's curriculum don't need any skills and all that kind of rubbish, and also saying letting the children just have a free-for-all and do whatever they like is not an education, but it's nothing like that.
Yes.
And I think any teacher that were to just try it for a few lessons would quickly see, because what tended to happen with these very sceptical teachers who we were researching, so I know exactly what was going on in their classrooms and exactly what they said to me, that even after the first two lessons, they're sort of bouncing around saying, this is amazing, my kids are actually listening to music in a way they've never listened to it before. My kids are actually engaging. You know, look at that kid over there who's never done anything in music education. There they are leading their group. My kids are actually, you know, as one of them actually said, one of the children said, we're actually becoming musicians. So, sorry, having said I don't like being evangelical about it, I probably am being, because I can't help it. No. But that's what I would say to somebody who...
Yeah, I think it's when you've had as much experience as you've had, Lucy, in observing the teachers working with students and the results, as you say, from that initial research. I think if anybody's entitled to be evangelical, I think you are. And I would certainly echo that. I mean, people would probably level the same thing at me, having been involved with Musical Futures. A lot of people would say to me as well, well, it's all right for you work for Musical Futures. However, like you, have seen lots of teachers dip their toe in the water, be fairly skeptical, and then, had an epiphany and sort of like thought, well, this is actually, I've not been teaching in this way before, but actually this is the way that I need to teach in order to get the best from my students. However,
I'll just say one more thing. I mean, there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that this way of learning music, when it comes to using recordings to learn the music from, is over 100 years old. And it was invented by musicians themselves across the world who had access to recordings, and in the absence of any systematic information system or educational system telling them to do it, all these young musicians thought of it for themselves and have been for over 100 years using this method. It's a real method that exists in the world out there, and that's why it works. And of course, going back to before recordings were available, and in some musical traditions obviously still carrying on, where learning is done in the musical group by listening and copying, imitating, not by the traditional teaching approach that we understand as teaching. So the reason why it works is because it has worked outside the school. It was developed by musicians outside the school.
Of course. I think that's fantastic, Lucy. That I think any teacher who would be nervous, I think having heard you speak about Musical Futures and about informal learning in that way, definitely would give it a go. So through your research and your work at the Institute of Education, you've seen lots of practice and worked with many music teachers. What would you consider to be the top 3 factors of being a successful music teacher that you have observed and have seen sort of like really have that sort of like that critical impact?
Well, I think I could almost say one top factor, which kind of divides into 3 parts, and the headline term for it is listening. And when I say listening, I mean listening in 3 ways. One is listening to what the students say, what they say to you, to each other, how they describe their relationship with music, what they say about music, and also encouraging them to express themselves on these matters, so that we are learning about them as young musicians, young listeners with musical identities, with musical knowledge that they've acquired outside the school. We have a curiosity to find out about them.
Absolutely.
So that's one way of listening. And another way of listening is listening to them when they're in the process of learning. So by that, I kind of again mean slightly standing back, not jumping in as soon as you see somebody playing a wrong note or wrong rhythm or holding their hand in the wrong way, but looking at and listening to what they're actually doing before we jump in and correct them, and try to work out, as I said before, what goals they're setting themselves, what aspects of what they're doing they're finding difficult, where they themselves would like to improve, and helping them to do that. And then thirdly, listening to the music that they make itself very carefully, because, you know, and with very open ears, because it's very easy to listen to a student, let's say a student composition or a student performance, and say, oh, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. But on the other hand, perhaps it's not wrong. Perhaps it's what they wanted. If it was what they wanted, to play this note like that, or to leave half a bar out here, or do a 5-beat bar or something, then is it actually wrong? And then if you think about, you know, lots of music that has these kinds of features, particularly irregular features. I mean, for example, my husband's doing an amazing study at the moment of a band who the older members of Music Futures might remember as the Incredible String Band. You might remember, Fran.
Yeah.
They were an incredibly original band in the 70s, really, late 60s and 70s. And they have a lot of irregular 5/5 bars, 3/4 meters, 5/4 bars, you know, all sorts of things that you might want to say, oh, that's wrong, if you're looking at it from an Ofsted or a music exam point of view. But actually, that's what gives the character to music and makes it so amazing.
Of course,
so
yeah.
I'm saying, listening to the music that the kids have produced, and with very open ears, and being willing to hear new things. And also, the music might sound like music that they listen to at home that you've never even actually heard. So being very, very careful to judge that too quickly. Yeah, that's what I would say, listening to the kids in a very, very broad sense of the word listening.
Brilliant, thank you.
You know, Fran, I've just remembered something which is sort of the opposite of your question. What would make a not very good music teacher? And I remember once being in a school where I was in a practice room with the teacher, where kids were all over the place doing various things, and there was a boy playing the keyboard, and he was obviously struggling to get what he was trying to do, but I didn't know what he was trying to do. And the teacher of the class leant over his shoulder and said, I don't know what his name was, Brian or something. He said, the trouble with you, Brian, is you've got absolutely no sense of rhythm. And I thought, well, that's the end of Brian's confidence as a musical person for the rest of his life, isn't it?
Absolutely,
so yeah. Another headline word would be encouragement, rather than criticism and discouragement. I mean, I'm sure all the teachers, everybody knows that, but what's not always so obvious is that one can be very discouraging oneself. You can have the principle, this man did, he said, I always encourage all my students, but he didn't seem to realise that he wasn't being encouraging.
Yeah, so some self-reflection in the way that you work with your students, obviously very important.
And again, you see, that comes from listening to the child in this broad sense of listening.
Mm. So thinking now about how your book, How Popular Musicians Learn. So since that was published, the listening habits of students has changed quite a lot, and a lot of the music that young people listen to is created on computers rather than instruments. Does music education in schools require a big shift towards technology in order to reflect the music that they enjoy, like, and identify with, do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely it does. I mean, everything is of its time and place, isn't it?
Yeah.
When How Popular Musicians Learn, there were youngsters engaging in, technological music. And the reason I didn't look at those was because I needed a focused study. Obviously, if you spread your focus too broadly, you can't get any results. Not for any reason to do with me not thinking it's important or shouldn't be an education. It definitely should, of course. And since then, music technology education has exploded, hasn't it?
It has, yes.
There's now a journal, Music Technology and Education. There's also the journal of the Association of Popular Music Education. Their journal, a lot of articles in there carry stuff on
exactly,
electronics, musics and things. So of course music education has to move with the times, whatever's happening in those times.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. So I'm just going to quick look at that one. So again, since How Popular Musicians Learn was published, we've had several government announcements about the teaching of music, and more recently the model music curriculum. What impact do you feel these documents have had on music education?
You'd know the answer to that better than me, Fran, because you've got your finger on the pulse of what's going on in schools much more than I have nowadays. But most of the time, to be honest, I just don't pay any attention to these government directives. To me, they make no difference. And the one good thing about the music model curriculum is that it says that music is important and that kids have an entitlement to it. But apart from that, the suggestions of curriculum content could have been written when the national curriculum was first developed in 1992. They're hardly any different, and there's nothing about pedagogy. There's nothing about learning by listening and copying. I mean, I seem to remember they've got a Billie Holiday track in their list of things that would be good to do. They've totally ignored the fact that all the musicians on that track and other tracks that they've also put in their list learnt to play music in the way that musicians learn and how kids in musical future schools are learning. So how can you possibly put a type of music into a curriculum and ignore the learning methods that the musicians who make that music underwent? I mean, that used to go on for years and years, but it's not happening nowadays in music education. People have much more respect for music now than that. And, so I just think it's a complete waste of time, really, apart from the fact that it says music is important. And I think any good music teacher will know that the end results of what are sought by Ofsted and the national curriculum and all the rest of it can be achieved through many, many different means. And these means are largely left out of a curriculum that has been put together by people who just don't know what, frankly, and I'm saying this publicly, aren't I? But certainly some of the people on that committee, I would say, don't know what they're doing. Taught in classrooms of music, etc., etc.
I don't think you'd be alone in that. And from a personal observation, what it has done is to undermine the confidence of some teachers who felt that they were doing things very well and were serving the needs of their students musically. But suddenly something that's come out from as a sort of a, it's not statutory, but head teachers are feeling a little bit nervous about it. So we get the top-down pressure as ever to make sure that are you doing the model music curriculum? Is what we're doing fitting within the model music curriculum? So lots of teachers that I know that had a very sort of like sound, pedagogically sound curriculum, and we were doing some really first-class work, particularly in primary schools where very many of the teachers aren't specialists. Are suddenly sort of like feeling quite
that's
quite underconfident now about what they should be doing. So there's a job of work there to be done around sort of like saying it's not necessarily about the what, it's the how. that really
Exactly.
is important. So
Yeah.
that's great.
Because the same things are achieved.
Exactly, exactly.
And they're achieved extremely well, but that's terrible. I didn't know that people were feeling so threatened by it. That's really awful.
I mean, I don't think that's across the board, but certainly I've been working with a primary school recently, and that one of the first questions was
Yeah.
what does Musical Futures do to support the model music curriculum? And I said, we don't do anything, and we've already got it's not the what that's there, it's the how that's the important, and so fortunately we've been able to sort of like address that. So it's
what I would have said, I wouldn't have said that. I would have said we do address the modern music curriculum, because everything that we do could not be criticised by looking at the model music curriculum and then looking at what Musical Futures is doing.
We offer some very similar works. It's the how that we tackle them that I think is the difference there.
Model music curriculum doesn't give a how though, does it?
No,
I mean, it's a while since I read it. It doesn't talk about pedagogy at all. It's just a list of content. So,
yes.
I think you can say Musical Futures is doing the model music curriculum. It was the same with the national curriculum, when we developed it. When I first did this in classrooms, actually before Musical Futures started, I used the informal learning approach and the breaking down of tracks and playing along with broken down tracks approach in 4 schools in London before I joined Musical Futures. And some teachers said to me, this will never take off, because it doesn't fit in with the national curriculum. But those weren't the teachers who were actually doing it. Because once they'd done it, they said, this is amazing. I can go through my outcomes and I can tick off every single national curriculum.
Absolutely.
Including notation, actually, because we had a form of notation in the broken down, the stage, it was the second stage after the...
Yes, for the word up, the cameo that we were talking about. That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so...
yes, you're right. We do the model music curriculum, but we don't talk. We talk about a range of music which is equally as important.
Yeah.
We just don't frame it with any sort of title. Anyway, moving on, because we've got so many to get through. Okay, so we'd just be interested, or we've had a question about your opinion, really. So, in your opinion, what needs to happen in the next 10 years to make sure that music education delivered in classrooms is first class?
Oh boy, I mean, get rid of certain people in government would be one thing. They could try listening to music teachers, for example, couldn't they?
I think there's been a collective cheer from the music education profession there, Lucy.
I'm never very keen on predicting the future or saying what's needed in the future, because I think what we have to focus on is the present, what we're doing in the present, and making sure that it's robust. And if it is robust and it's good, it will survive one way or the other. And then looking at the good practice that we're doing, not just in Musical Futures, but other projects and other classrooms that don't use Musical Futures, but
indeed,
doing great things, and building on those and developing those things in further and further ways. I mean, that's just what music ed or any education has always done. I can't have a magic answer to that question other than saying that. I don't think we do need to build up a workforce of confident teachers who know the fundamentals of what they're doing, which is about firstly motivating children. I mean, if the kids aren't motivated, you can say goodbye to the whole thing. Being inclusive, finding ways to differentiate so that the lowest ability and the fastest learners equally can be stretched at their own levels. But these things are already in place. I mean, there's nothing new about the next 10 years, I don't think.
No. So thinking about sort of like you talking about preparing and getting people in place. So is PGCE or school-based teacher training effective in creating the kind of teachers we need in the classroom, or what changes do you think are needed in initial teacher training to create the kinds of teachers we need?
It would be a bit of a cheek of me to answer that question, because I haven't worked in an initial teacher education classroom for about 5 years myself. I mean, the last 4 or 5 years since I last, and that was just to give a couple of lectures and seminars to the the students. It's
Mm-hmm.
even longer since I was actually working on a PGCE course and
Mm-hmm.
going around schools observing student teachers. So can you ask the question again? I've gone off.
Yeah, so is PGCE or schools-based
Yeah.
teacher training effective in creating the kind of teachers we need in the classroom? Or what changes do you think we might need to create the kinds of teachers that we do need?
So as I say, it would be a bit of a cheat for me to really say what changes we need. You would probably be in a much better position to know that, Fran, yourself. I mean, what changes would you say?
Well, I mean, obviously, for primary school teachers, they get very little time on music. It does depend from course to course, but on average, I think the last time I worked with some primary teachers, I was asking what the average amount of time they'd spent actually covering how to teach music in the curriculum. As a generalist teacher, I think it was 1 to 2 hours.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I always think about secondary. I mean, that is absolutely right with the primary phase. That would be a great thing if we could have a sensible amount of time that people.
I mean, obviously, I'm not aware of what it's like, in other countries around the world, but certainly here, in the UK, it's very scant, and which is why when, we're asking teachers as generalist teachers to teach music in the classroom, that's why many of them feel very underconfident. I mean, I've had experience as a primary music school teacher myself, and I think the only thing I can liken it to is having to teach PE, which is a practical subject of which I wasn't qualified in. So, it is absolutely fundamental that teachers get the right kind of support so that they can deliver meaningful musicians, so that they can make their lessons, as you pointed out, Lucy, inclusive, and so that every child that walks through their classroom door can feel like they are a musician. That's my huge belief on that.
And I also wish, I mean, I don't know really what it's like now, but there was a time when teachers were released far more often than nowadays to do, whole day or 2-day, or even I went on a 10-day training course. It was a day a week for 10 weeks. And, I learned so much on that course. That was in about 1987. It was fantastic. And also because on those kinds of days and events, you can meet other teachers. Music teachers are very isolated often, aren't they?
Indeed.
In primary schools, even then, okay, so there's everybody in the school is a generalist, but sometimes only 1 or 2 of them are meant to take music, aren't they? So they're often very isolated, and secondary teachers are often very isolated. And just having more training days, not training, I hate that word, more days when teachers can think about their work, develop their practice in collusion with other teachers, exchange ideas. I mean, I know Musical Futures do this kind of thing.
We do pre-pandemic, and we're looking forward to introducing some face-to-face training. But over this last year, we've curated a number of sort of like informal gatherings for teachers, and I think we've probably seen over 1,000 teachers sort of like online, with just sort of like just would anybody like to get together? Again, not about necessarily musical features, but just how are we going to cope teaching music as a practical subject in a pandemic? It's about what can we do collectively to support each other, to provide the very best experiences in our classrooms.
So what would be really great would be if the government would fund and provide more of these kinds of opportunities, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's a question. We've touched on the pandemic and the effect that it's had on sort of like music teaching in schools, and the effect that it's had on teachers, and obviously particularly if you're working in a single department, music department, as you often do, it can be very difficult, to sort of like to think about things. So I'd like you to answer now is, how do you envisage the future of informal learning in school music lessons, particularly in a post-pandemic world?
Yeah, well, it's another question about the future, isn't it? So I'm always very cautious about envisaging the future. That's your dog barking, isn't it? It's distracting. No, it's fine. Mine will start in a minute. I think what I can say from what I know is that teachers have been absolutely amazing during this pandemic in the way that they've kept things going. And also not only music teachers, but you know, music conductors of choirs and orchestras. I don't mean just professional ones, but lots and lots of amateur groups who their leaders have found incredible amounts of ways to keep everybody engaged, keep everybody singing, playing. And I know music teachers have done the same. So I think probably a great deal has been learnt from that, hasn't it? And there is undoubtedly more to learn. And if this pandemic situation continues, then that will also continue. I mean, we are getting very well vaccinated here, but in some parts of the world, you know, they're only just beginning. In Africa, they're only just beginning to get the first wave of a really, really serious virus. And goodness knows how long that is going to take. So how long, you're talking about a post-pandemic world. I mean, who knows how long it's going to be before the actual world is post-pandemic. That's very, very frightening. So that's probably not a very good answer to your question, but that's, I would say, we have to build on what we've already been doing.
Lovely, thank you, Lucy. Yes, do excuse my dogs. I told you that they would make an appearance.
They were distracting me, but not to worry. It's life is life, isn't it? And we're all working at home.
I think somebody's arrived at the door, but anyway, I'm ignoring them. So moving on to the next question now. So having seen firsthand how informal learning has been adopted in other countries, do you have any observations about what it is that makes informal learning so transferable to different formal school systems and music education settings?
Yeah, I mean, that's another great question. I obviously myself was fascinated to see what would happen when people started using the approaches in other countries. I thought when it went into Australia, their music education system is not so very different from ours. So I wasn't that surprised that it kind of worked the same. Similar with Canada, their music ed system is, you know, not that different. The United States, of course, is a very different music ed system to ours. And I was very surprised that anybody did want to use the, especially the informal learning approach in the USA. But apparently it's being used more and more there in sort of different ways, including people adapting it for the band and the choir. My belief would be that if it was used there at all, as you know, they have this band stream and this choir stream, and then they have the 80% of other kids who aren't in band or in choir. And I've always felt, well, it would be used with the 80%, but actually it seems to be being used with the band and the choir as well. So that requires quite a lot of adaptation, but it's been very encouraging. But then when we get to countries such as Brazil, where the informal learning approach has been tried and succeeded, despite a lack of resources, instruments, spaces for the kids to work. And also it's now being used in Mexico, as you know, or they're just beginning to use it in Mexico.
That's right, yes. They're looking forward to working with those guys.
And in Singapore, you know, it's been working. I believe people have been taking it to China. Well, actually, I know from some of my own students have tried it out in China. So, yes, sorry, I'm probably getting really boring here, aren't I?
Not at all.
Point is, you asked me why it's so transferable. And I think, again, it's because it is based on a learning practice which grew up through the practice of young musicians, and as they got older musicians across the world, in countries all across the world for the last 100 years. That's what it's based on. So, and then it can come into the school in an adapted form, but it should work anywhere. And I have sort of theorized that what happens when, say, a child or a group of children are asked to choose a piece of music that they like and listen to a recording of it and learn it by ear, is a kind of, what happens, I would describe, as a sociologist, I'm very cautious to use the word natural, but I would describe it as a natural learning practice. And the reason I can say this is because across the first 21 schools that we tried it, where we collected detailed data, we found that kids across all those schools were doing similar things. And one of the things that fascinated me most of all was I started to notice that in the very, very early stages of the learning, obviously your teachers will be familiar, the instrument that the majority of kids jump on first is the drums, whether it's a hand drum or some other percussion or just tapping on the table. I started to notice that some of the kids in every single group doing this, so a kid in several of the groups, children would be playing the rhythm of the vocal line on the drum rather than what the drums are doing on the recording. So if the vocal line was going da 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 da, the drummer would be going right, and
Absolutely,
then only later on the person playing the drums or somebody else starts to think, hang on, that's not actually what the drums are playing. And I actually thought children think drums play pitches. They are so alienated in some cases from the music that they listen to. Now, that I called a natural learning process because it happened across 21 schools in this country, without the kids in the schools knowing each other or observing each other, or the teachers observing or knowing each other. So it arose spontaneously. And so I think I haven't done any research on it, but from what I have heard from colleagues, these same things are arising spontaneously in other schools when the informal learning practices are brought in countries across the world. And so there is something, it's not natural to put on a recording and learn to play from it, because a recording is a human-made object, right?
Yeah.
But what is natural is that given the human-made object of the recording and the classroom and the situation that you're in, what then happens with the learning process is a natural process. Of that I'm fairly confident, really.
Fantastic. So Lucy, we've had a number of people tune in, and we've got Fernando from Brazil. I think we've actually covered what he would like to ask, but as he's taken the time to tune in from Brazil, I really would like to put your question to him. He said, in your opinion, what has changed in the informal music learning practices described in your book, How Popular Musicians Learn, compared to practices today?
Fernando, I can't see you or hear you, but I assume you mean how, not what's changed within the classroom and the way it's interpreted in classrooms, but what's changed in the way that popular musicians
yes, I think that's my understanding of it as well.
Yes, obviously the role of technology is the big number one in that, isn't it? Because technology, and especially during the pandemic, more and more people, I think, have been turning to the internet to learn, and that has been a very, very major thing. But something I would want to say is that I don't think using the internet to learn from changes the actual informal learning processes. It's an informal way to learn. Okay, so you might be looking at the internet to learn how to play the guitar, let's say. You might be following a course which is very, very highly structured, but the teacher's not there telling you you're doing something wrong. You can wind it forwards, you can wind it back, you can say, oh, this bit's really boring, or I don't want to learn to play those chords. I'll push it forward, right? So you're still in control of the learning. And although you'll be watching as much as listening, if it was a case of learning the guitar, you'll be watching where the fingers are and all the rest of it. I would still say that it is essentially, and again, I use that word carefully, but it is essentially the same as learning from a recording, which is what musicians have done for 100 years before that. So doing it online does change the amount of visual impact that the learning has, so you can learn much more from seeing. But of course, musicians have always learned from seeing, The particular study that I did was about how they learnt when they're practicing a recording, but musicians have always learnt from watching each other informally and formally as well. So the means of the learning, or the way that the learning, the resource, the medium through which the learning takes place, and the resource of the learning has changed when the learning is online. But the actual processes of learning, I would say personally, are much the same. It'd be interesting to know what Fernando thinks about that.
So Fernando, I know that obviously we're just getting your question through the YouTube live chat, but if you'd like to email us at Musical Futures, and we could pass on your thoughts to Lucy, we'd be really interested to hear. So that just about wraps up our session with you, Lucy. I am so grateful for you taking the time out of your lovely life now in your new home. Well, you've been there a few years now, haven't you?
4 years.
4 years. Gosh, time does fly. Really but I know that you're making the most of your retirement, and obviously still continuing with aspects of your music.
Yeah. I'm doing so much work, I don't feel like I've retired.
Well, maybe they ought to extract the word retired from your bio.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
I'm going to say, well, everybody seems to be keeping you busy, and not least us, and obviously you'll be still keeping in touch with the chaps in Mexico who are hoping to use Musical Futures.
Well, Fran, I mean, do I get a chance to thank you? Because I'd really like to thank you for inviting me to do this talk.
Oh, bless you, Lucy.
It's so lovely to be involved with Musical Futures still after all these years, and I'm so proud of the work that you do. I really am, and it's a huge privilege to be able to give this time talking to you.
Thank you, Lucy. Bless you. No, that really the pleasure and the honour is all ours. I mean, really, it's sorry, I'm having a bit of a fan moment here. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in from wherever you are in the world. And so if you've got any further questions for us at Musical Futures, please do feel free to get in touch. We've already had quite a few inquiries about Musical Futures already over the last week, and so we're thrilled to sort of wrap up our live session with you, Lucy, and thank you, and over and out.
Over and out.